I would like to call upon the Prime Minister to open this debate. Hear, hear.
Can everybody hear me? Fantastic.
Yeah.
I prefer, like, if you could show me like a sheet, because I don't look at the chat. Fab. I'm going to have 3 points in my speech. Firstly, I'm going to tell you what the likely counterfactual is going to be. Secondly, I'm going to prove that we're getting better politician performance and accountability on our side. And lastly, I'm going to tell you why we increase the diversity of politicians on our side of the house. So firstly, in terms of what the counterfactual is, so we think that at the moment where politicians are not scrutinized based off their like personal identity, so it's like they're not, the focus isn't on their gender, their sexuality, their past partners, or the stuff that they do in private, so like who they're married to, what their businesses are, etc. I think you're much more likely to look at like highlight professional stuff, so stuff that you do in your position as a politician. So you're going to focus on things like voting records, you're going to focus on the promises that you have done to your electorate, the policies that you have championed, etc. Why do we find that this is the likely counterfactual? Firstly, because I think that people find it very, very scandalous at the moment where politicians like don't fulfill their promises. And I think the fact that that is true means that they're likely to like buy magazines that talk about this, etc. I think that what that does is that it then fulfills the interest of private actors like the media that like have profit incentives, therefore are very likely to find this like the next best thing in terms of what would get them money when they're talking about politicians. I also think that these things can be framed as enticing, so like politician betrays their constituency, etc. But I also think at the same time that media is increasingly becoming more decentralized, which means that people in a grassroots way are likely to revert to this option, to get to highlight, like to scrutinize what politicians are actually doing in parliament as opposed to the stuff that they're doing in their private life. So it looks like people calling them out on Twitter, etc. for the stuff that they're doing. I think given the heated nature of Twitter and the fact that it's pretty addictive in terms of how its timeline is, I think that's very likely to be effective in terms of holding like highlighting wrong things that politicians are doing in terms of accountability. So why do we have better politician performance? I think on like just off the bat, I think you're much more likely to increase the amount of public scrutiny that exists. At the moment where you focus on people's voting records and the actual policies that they support, what you do is firstly, you make it unlikely for them to be able to defect criticism via like pointing to something that they did in their life. So for example, like people like Donald Trump are able to point to the fact to like his private stuff that is definitely more like flashy than thinking about like his voting record. And given that his base predominantly agrees that his crimes are not that relevant, then he keeps the media narrative on the crimes as opposed to scrutinizing his voting record, which is much more controversial amongst Republicans. I think it makes it likely for politicians to be able to shield criticism on the stuff that actually impacts people. Because very crucially, like your individual policy stance, or sorry, like your personal life, etc., does not impact your policy unless it does directly, in which case we cover it with our counterfactual because we will be criticizing that. Secondly, I think a lot of people escape critique because they are part of minority groups. So for example, the leader of the Scottish Conservatives is like, well, I can't possibly be bigoted because I am LGBT, which means that she is able to then pass policies that disproportionately help LGBT people in parliament. I think at the moment where we are able to look, when the media narrative about her only focuses not on like her sexual background, but rather on the stuff that she actually pushes to parliament, what you are able to get is, so firstly, you are able to get more public awareness about what things are happening in parliament. That means like more activists tweeting about this rather than their personal justification, more media, like more TV public focused particularly on their actions particularly. That means that voters are better able to, one, like sign petition, two, engage in other like grassroots activities, three, vote these people out of their places of employment, like tarnish, and four, like this this then means that their reputation is tarnished at the moment where they're branded as somebody that does not that does not follow through. Crucially, like currently in democracy, we don't have an accountability mechanism for politicians after they're elected. So I think that does like put more pressure on politicians. So secondly, I think they also have self-corrective incentives. So knowing that the public narrative is much more likely to be focused on their votes, they're much more likely to vote in line with the promises that they previously made in their campaign, which means that you're much more likely to get more representative policies and increase the amount of like representativity and democracy in your democracy, which is probably which we believe is a very good principial good, because we think that like every person has like an inherent right to determine the like course of their life, and at the moment where their decisions are bridged by politicians who do not follow their incentives, that is wrong. Why do we have a higher diversity of politicians? I think that the frame we're relying on here is that they're in the overwhelming majority of countries that we're talking about, like the cultural, the default cultural values are like values that we think are bigoted, right? So like being LGBT is not something that is like normal in most countries in the world, definitely not most like stable democracies. I think that there's a minority of cases where that is true. So what does that do? Firstly, I think it pushes more diverse politicians out of politics rather than the reverse, right? Because society is much more likely to, at the moment where we focus on your sexuality, etc., much more likely to discredit LGBT people because they're much more likely to be bigoted, etc. Secondly, well, before that, can I get a POI from closing if you have any?
Yeah, on your side, all of the stuff still happens. The difference is that they're not focusing on all of this kind of stuff, which means that once you just say that person is LGBT, they're out because it's the one big thing that everybody's talking about suddenly.
Okay, so I think that I've already proven that they talk about their voting record, so people already know about this person. But second, like media narrative, like raise awareness, right? So like the fact that this was like something like headlining on Fox News that this person is like LGBT, etc., then like that like makes more people aware, and therefore more people more likely to vote against this person. This is my argument precisely, and what I'm getting in is like more people are likely to vote against this person because they've seen news coverage, etc. On your side of the house, it's very unlikely that this ever gets out. Secondly, I think that you prevent these people from being harassed, because I can't like understate this enough, but like the media and the type of like tabloids and stuff like that are focusing on these people's private lives are genuinely engaging in like unacceptable harassment because of profit incentives and because they want to create the scandal. I think firstly, this is principally illegitimate at the moment where we expose these people for stuff that they do in their private life. This is not something that they're accountable to towards their voters. But secondly, I think it's just a harm that we prevent this from happening, right? Like this type of harassment. But I think in terms of impact, I think one, you get higher diversity of representation. You get more role models like people like AOC like showing Latina girls that they're able to feed back into their democracy. And secondly, statistically more likely to get diverse policies. Beg you to propose.
Great, thank you very much for this speech. I would like to now invite the leader of the opposition. Here.
Cool, could I do a quick wee mic check?
Yeah, you're audible.
All right.
Whenever you're ready.
All right, Kirsty, let me just get my notes together. Three, two, one. It might sound weird for a debater to be saying this, but I think the internal mechanisms of politics and voting records and shit is just boring as fuck, right? And I think if the point of our counterfactual regarding accountability relies on some form of engagement occurring in the first place, I think if the point that you don't get those people engaged and get their initial foot in the door in the first place, it's unclear to what extent any actual stringent accountability can come from the actions of those who have already been engaged with the political establishment in the first place. I think if the point the opening government are contingent on this large degree of engagement actually happening to reach these benefits, I think they've specifically missed that burden. But I have two additional responses to the material that we get from it, because the opening government posit to you that people are able to escape scrutiny because they're able to say, oh, I'm a minority, how can I be oppressing minorities? I just think this is a fucked assertion, right? And I'm going to structurally prove why it's actually the opposite, because note at the point that you represent a minority or elect a minority on account of you believing that they are going to represent represent your issues and act as somebody who is going to support you, I think that necessarily creates a high expectation on them, whereby you believe that they are somebody who should be representing your voice, and you believe that they are somebody who has got your back. I think at the point that you have this new expectation on them that you would not have for any other politician, because you just assume that they will not represent your views, I think this is when they necessarily will be up to the highest degree of scrutiny. I think we win that clash in opening. Secondly, on diversity, which most of my substantive will clash with, but I want to just note here that, like, now you just have your voting record attacked rather than your actual characteristics attacked. What this means is, at the point that you are a minority, presumably you want to be voting for minority issues. This looks like voting for LGBT issues in your parliamentary voting record. At the point where this is true, now the media just attack them for that rather than attacking them for the actual characteristics that they possess. What this means is, in order for opening government to accrue any impact, the only minorities that can get elected are those who don't vote for minority issues and thus can't have this highlighted in their voting record by the media. I don't think this accrues any impact at the point where the policy doesn't actually get passed, and it has to be so invisible that people aren't able to accrue any degree of representation from the first place. OG are out of this debate. 3 things in this speech. Firstly, much needed characterization on who engages with identity superseding politics. Secondly, on representation. Thirdly, why character is quite important. I think the important piece of framing to note here is that whiteness and straightness is necessarily a default within the majority of these societies. That is to say that at the point that these are the characteristics that are always represented in these systems, the people who possess these characteristics do not vote based on their identity, but rather they vote based on the structures that they have all enjoyed their whole life and that have constantly been reflected within politics. The crucial ramification of this, then, is that the people who are going to vote based on identity rather than politics are those who do not find their voices represented within the political institutions already. They're people who have been deprived of other capital in order to accrue mobilization to mitigate this asymmetry, and at the point that they can now utilize this capital and this narrative to get people who are like them to mobilize behind them and to try and break their way into the structures that have locked them out, this is when the focus on identity becomes particularly crucial. At the point we need some degree of amelioration for the asymmetry between those who are entrenched within politics and those who have been shut out. We think these are the people who vote on identity. We think these are the actors that we win this debate on. Why do we get then better representation for them? 2 strands to this. First of all, just on relatability, because note here, the politicians are specifically distant figures, and at the point that you shroud them only in their voting record and specifically shut out aspects of them that make them appear like they are human, this is probably when you are going to get less engagement with the political institutions in the first place, right? I think this is broadly good, because at the point you are engaging with politics because you feel like they are people who are like you and thus have the capacity to represent you, this is like when you are more likely to buy into the system. And crucially, this is when those who generally don't engage on account of people within those systems feeling too distant and unable to look after them, this is when they are going to be more likely to engage at the point they get this relatability factor. No OG do the analysis for us as to why this representation is good, because the vote is a good in and of itself at the point where people are able to feel represented by a system and the system is able to meet its burden. But crucially, we get the impacts of the additional capacity to mobilize and the additional capacity to buy into state systems in their entirety at the point you are less afraid and distanced from it. Why do we get more voices and specifically empower those who lack access? Noting my framing earlier. The crucial thing to note here is that all members of minorities share some degree of symmetric struggles and issues that they face regardless of internal differences between them. What this means is, at the point where people are able to campaign on their identity and the specific differences that they suffer as a result of it, this is when you are able to create a degree of understanding between you and those within the political systems. Crucially, additionally, this is when you are able to spotlight these issues, because note that the discrimination minorities face generally isn't a consequence of malice, but rather ignorance. And at the point that you are able to platform people based on these minorities, this is when minority features, this is when you are able to highlight these specific aspects of ignorance, create a dialogue about it, and have some manner to try and fix this beyond the voting record, which gets symmetrically chastised on either side of the house. We think this is when you specifically refranchise those at the point you energize them and reintroduce their faith into democracy. I think beyond the principal impacts of this, I think this has a specific reparative principle value that you should buy at the point that we prove there is some degree that we are more likely to get shut out voices heard, and we prove that there is some mechanism by which these identities who have been shut out of accessing institutions now have the capacity to be involved in it. We think think you get more engagement. We think you get this principal value. We think you get additional mobilization. Fuck's sake, I'm out of time. Why then is character so specifically important in this debate? Sorry, Hamza. I think the specific importance of characters in this is threefold. First of all, I think the character of an individual indicates what sort of actions they are likely to do. I think it indicates that they might be a risk taker, that they might lack compassion, that this job might specifically be a stepping stone for them. OG cite the example of Trump. Crucially, Trump was able to shroud his character in the policy promises that he made, and at the point that he made this, the specific character aspects that could have diminished him otherwise now get shrouded in the policy, and people lack this indicator of what they are likely to do. Secondly, people just probably want to feel moral. It is probably good to have as much information as possible to try and reap this benefit. Thirdly, the specific principle of truth in order to make an informed decision. We think people need as much information as possible so that they know that their vote is being valued, so that they know they're engaging properly. We think this is why you specifically have to require a focus, right? Because most interests come from background like socio-economic class, meaning that the policy that is chosen is probably symmetric. The differential then is the distinction when it is a fresh identity that has never been represented before and cannot be shrouded in policy. You have to side with O.
Cool. Thank you very much for this speech. I would like to now invite the Deputy Prime Minister. Here.
Can you all hear me?
Yeah, you're audible.
Okay, 3, 2, 1. The first thing that the ALO brings us is the fact that the mechanisms that we bring you are apparently very boring, like things like voting records are something that no one cares about. I'm just going to then reiterate what Julie brings you in the counterfactual. Look, there is always going to be a scrutiny in politics because politics plays a large part in a lot of people's lives, like it affects them on a day-to-day level when it comes to the rights, the number of benefits they get, things like this. Like, so there will always be like media attention around politics and politicians, right? Therefore, in the counterfactual, when it is no longer on their lives, it is going to be on like their voting actions. Like you might say this is boring right now, but when you no longer have their personal lives to divert to, what does the media have to focus on? The media will focus on things like when they break promises or when they vote against things that they said they would stand for, right? Why is this the case? It's because the media have to dramatize things. Like if this is boring as they claim it is to be, the media has a narrative and they can frame these things so they are absolutely scandalous. Like they have broken a promise to you that you voted them into office based on, right? That is something that can be inflamed and inflated by the media to make it dramatic and get people engaged, because there will always be some engagement around politics. It is now just diverted and purely focused on things like voting records, which may be status quo be boring when you compare that to like, oh, who slept with who and things like that. That is why you can, because the media loves scandals, that is why things like this are relevant and why these are not boring even if they are boring mechanisms of status quo, in the counterfactual, this is why they are good accountability mechanisms, right? I think then they then say like, oh, minorities vote. The people who vote for minorities vote for them because they feel represented or for minority issues. I think there's a lot of things with the stuff that they bring out in the beginning of their speech, right? I think first of all, when they talk about like, oh, minorities identify themselves with other minority politicians. First of all, I think like minority politicians, like LGBT people, are firstly disadvantaged in large parts of the world, like across the world. It is not status quo to be LGBT, in some places considered taboo. So I think in a lot of places, even if you do not know they are directly LGBT, like you can probably still like understand by their voting records that they are probably on your side or pushing towards something that is more progressive like that. Second of all, I think that and they then talk about things like the importance of relatability and that you buy into state systems because you see people like you, right? I just don't know why this is necessary. I think this is true to some extent, but I think it is very limited, because I think when voting records and what people actually stand for is at the center of like the debate and the center of attention, I think that is far more important. For example, Jeremy Corbyn is a straight white man, and I still voted for him and I still like him and I still find him relatable because I know from his voting records and I know from his like political history and his past, which would have a lot more attention in under our counterfactual, that he is likely to like campaign for minority rights both on like a race and like LGBT issues, which like directly affect me, right? So I think that like when even like if you like I think we are willing to take this trade-off, because even then you get like people like who are straight white men, but like you know who are going to do good things for you and are not full of empty promises because this thing is under more scrutiny. I also think like this is a minority case, but it also goes the other way. For example, Tim Farron, right? It came out in like just before the 2017 election, it came out that he was actually homophobic, right? But the point is that like I don't think this matters as much because the consequences of actions have always been good. Despite him saying that like gay sex is a sin. He has always campaigned for the right to be who you are. He, as leader of the Liberal Democrats, he has always actively pushed, like he has actively campaigned for LGBT rights. So no matter what he thinks in his own personal time and personal head, those actions have never actually manifested themselves into any negative action. So I think you would get less focused on things like that, and instead of people being like, I can't vote for Tim Farron because he's homophobic, I'm going to vote for the Tories, which are obviously a much more homophobic party. But like things like that would not happen. But then when it comes to the point about the character of an individual is important because it indicates what they're likely to do and like what they're to vote for. Look, if you're a racist person and you say racist things that these things aren't picked up for, you're still likely to vote in more racist policies like anti-immigration things or things that disproportionately affect like black people, like more stringent and strict policing, things like that. So like I think a lot of the racist things will probably come across in the policy that you're supporting. Same with like if you're pro-LGBT, you're going to advocate for gay marriage. I think this goes for the same for sexism. Even if you don't have someone in their private homes like saying something explicitly sexist, I think the fact that they advocate for or against like abortion laws is probably indicative of that in itself. I think that is much more important on like what they actually vote for and what they actually do instead of just anti-truths and jargon that can get people inside. Right. I then think the other thing they talk about is like people have a principle to the truth of characters, right? The principle that people have like a principle right to the truth of how someone is. But I think this is a problem, right? Personality politics is a problem. This is not a popularity contest. The principle of voting in an elected representative is someone who represents your particular views and what they want to implement in government, right? I think that is the duty of politicians, right? The problem with personality politics is that when you like someone because they are funny or something, you mean you're more likely to vote for them. Why is this bad, even if you like them? Because I don't think they necessarily always have the skills to like lead a country or to represent you properly. Like you might like them, but you are they might not necessarily represent what you actually want because they might not be of like actual intelligence or compromise or have organizational skills, things like that. I think that is why like when you have personality politics, which is much more prevalent under the opposition side of the house, you're more likely to vote in someone who does not have your best interests at heart. I think this is where like our case is much more nuanced because you're likely to see what they actually stand for and things like that. I think this looks like Theresa May not going on the One Show because it makes her look nice and like looks like a human. Like that's not what we want out of a prime minister. I think it looks like Theresa May then actually being forced to go and do a leader's debate. Does anybody have a POI from closing?
Yeah, you were talking about how you're informed by Corbyn and so on, how Dani voted for him. This shows that also on our side, we can tell people what the actual voting records are and maybe do so better because
but like not to flex or anything or like big myself up, but I'm not the average informed voter. I'm a member of the Labour Party. I do fucking debating. Like I'm not like I am way more invested in politics than any of my family. Like I'm not the average informed voter. But I'm just making a point that minorities can still relate to people even if they are not explicitly the same as them. Like I like relate to Jeremy Corbyn even though he is not obviously a small Chinese LGBT girl, right? Okay. I think the other thing that I wanted to say, I forgot what I was going to say actually. The other thing that I wanted to say is that on that thing about like personality politics and LGBT issues, right? I think if you have a homophobic person, you're still quite likely to vote in a Democrat because you believe in a lot of the democratic values like on tax or things like that or on healthcare. You're still likely to vote for them, even if you know that Democrat is going to push for progressive LGBT issues, right? Because even if you're homophobic, you think that there are other things that they are standing for which are more important. I think on the other hand, though, when like something in their background or in their past or their sexuality or something like that is in like the focus of their limelight, I think that is something that is likely to push people over the edge. I think that is when you have people who are like, oh, I really like the policies Jeremy Corbyn is standing for, but he once said this like slightly controversial thing in like the 90s, which is why I cannot vote for him. Or like this Democrat who has like brilliant ideas for health reform or something, like is a gay person and I just cannot abide by that. I think that is when you also get people like this. You get people, that type of person who has like very strong biases, who don't like necessarily vote on those issues, but would vote on the character of politicians. I think they then become much more rational voters and vote on the policies that they care about, not on the personality of their politicians. So proud to propose.
Great, thank you very much for this speech. I'd like to now invite the Deputy Leader of the Opposition, here.
Can I be heard?
Yeah, you're good to go.
Good. Okay, first just starting with a few direct responses, then I'm going to get into some rebuilding and some expansion of impacts. Okay, so I think a lot of the mechanisms by which OG claim people can objectively decide what's in their best interest are not quite as objective as they kind of would like them to be, right? So I think a good example is one that they've already brought up, which is like the election of Trump. I think most non-radical Trump supporters voted on the basis that their areas were facing huge economic devastation in the Rust Belt that Democrats simply didn't care about. So Hillary's policy record wasn't particularly better for these people. It's kind of a shit example, but also this kind of supports our point because in a way people were voting based on Trump's policy platform, his policy proposals to like reinvigorate all of these areas, but he simply just lied about a lot of them and didn't follow them up. Unlike what they like to claim in OG, most of these like promises that he's broken haven't really been called out by the media that much, like not even by extremely liberal sources. Like he just didn't follow up on them. So people can more easily lie about their policy platform than anything else about them. You can't really lie about like being black or being from like the Muslim community, but you can just lie about saying like, oh, I'm going to build a wall. It's quite easy. I think while most politicians have like fairly centrist neoliberal policy platforms, I think we still bring like a comparative benefit here, which is that policy is often tied to background. So people often act based off their own personal experiences, and like this isn't based on anything they can lie about or make up. Okay, and then on like media enforcing voting records, this was another thing they brought up. Now, even if like we allow them saying that voting records isn't like based on like personal actions, even though like voting is an action, so it could even fall under our side. I would like to just quickly note that like voting records can be easily twisted. So for example, there could be outrage that like, oh, this politician voted against the Clean Water Act, but like maybe they voted against it because they disagreed with a subclause. Basically what you're doing here is you're giving a ton of power to random media corporations that we have no particular reason to trust. They easily misrepresent things, and by OG's own analysis, they love drama and they'll make controversies about literally anything that they can twist. So I think I don't think this is a particularly reliable metric either, even if it falls under like our purview of the motion. Okay, so the last thing I'd like to talk about is this clash on like skill and ability. So like people will vote for politicians that are more skilled. I would like to first note that like if you're dictating skill based on experience, it's not always like best to only vote in like really old politicians with a lot of experience, because we would like some social change. And then also a lot of this stuff about like voting politicians that will be good as like the Minister of Health, right? These extremely specific roles, which are all dictated internally. Like you're not going to vote on like a minister, you're going to vote on a politician, and then their party will decide like what they end up actually doing. So like, again, most of this doesn't even matter. Okay, so on to like some rebuilding on why representation is important. I'm going to talk a bit more firstly about reparative justice and then about political momentum, but just to clarify some of what came out in Jason's speech, minorities generally think more on the grounds of identity because they're more conscious of it, right? So being like straight, being white, it's seen as the default in society. I think I'd like to like be charitable to like any extending teams to say that there are other like fringe identity movements that can exist that are like based on like being white, I guess, but we see that these are generally more rare, and a lot of them are actually based on like being poor or like not having a job or something, right? So I think we probably end up overall getting more candidates on our side that are voted in by oppressed people, because these are the people that have to think of every day about being afraid of like being victim of a hate crime. They think every day about being from like a community that's been historically like suppressed. These groups have like a common identity, and generally they have a very strong in-group preference because these are usually quite tight-knit communities because they've had to weather so much oppression over the years and historically. So a lot of the time this group is forced to always be aware of their identity and generally act quite often based on identity because it's such like an integral part of their everyday life and it poses like such a threat to them all the time. Okay, now that we've kind of won on the identity clash, I think I'd like to talk a bit about reparative justice. First, I'll take a POI from closing.
All of opening half is about the politics of the present. The problem is that the personalities of the past dominate the politics of the present. It's Mandela's African National Congress, Nehru's Indian National Congress, and the Republican Party of Reagan.
Okay, so you're talking about like cults of personality, I suppose, like people, I guess, voting for the Tories because they liked Maggie Thatcher back in the day. I think a lot of the reason why people liked these personalities is usually based on what they did, right? So people hate Maggie Thatcher because she like ruined the north of England, I think. Usually this is based on like the legacies of policies, and people will support people associated with these personalities not because like they thought Maggie Thatcher was a cool person, but because Maggie Thatcher was like her economics agreed with their policy ideals, and like other people have similar ideas to her. So I don't really think this is related to personality. It's more related to a legacy of policy decisions. Okay, on reparative justice. So when oppressed minorities reach office, they experience more mechanisms generally just to combat historical and current injustices leveled against them. By what mechanisms does this happen? Understanding. So while it's true that politicians are often in like different socioeconomic positions to the rest of the minority group that they come from, this differing class interest is likely symmetric across the entire political class, regardless of other IDs. So right, most politicians are quite centrist. They're usually middle class and up. This is symmetric. This happens all the time. However, rich ethnic minorities still experience racism. All like rich gay people still experience homophobia, etc., etc. These groups know, one, what discrimination and oppression experienced by that group looks like, and secondly, they have a greater likelihood of intimate knowledge of the historical injustice like felt by that group. So for an example, an older gay politician probably remembers homophobic laws and the impact that that had on the gay community, for example, during the AIDS crisis, which has like long-term impacts on that community and can explain a lot of like historical reasons behind like why these communities are different today. And like, okay, and as these groups are hence firstly more likely to just be aware these problems exist in the first place, they're more likely to draw attention to these issues and spotlight them, even if it's just like to self-promote, right? Even if it's for selfish reasons, they're more likely to talk about them and propose ways to address them. We get like more attention to issues of minorities. We get a more likelihood these issues are addressed. We get more reparative justice to historically oppressed groups. We also get more political momentum because like when a young member of like a oppressed minority sees a member of their group being in the highest like rung of politics possible, this has an energizing effect on the entire community. It encourages more of them to be politically involved. We get like a more significant political force for change within these communities. Overall, we get more policies that are friendly to redress the historical oppression of vulnerable groups. For all these reasons, proud to oppose.
Thank you for this speech. I would like to now invite the member of the government to open the closing half of this debate. Here.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yeah, you're audible.
Awesome. Okay. As Hamza points out in his POI, all of the impacts so far in this debate are contingent on a conception of only caring about politicians' private lives in the present, which I obviously think is fair. It's obviously a legitimate debate, but it's much more narrow because to the extent that policies do affect us in our day-to-day life, there's obviously a base level of attention you pay to them, which I think all sides concede to at a minimal level. I think the biggest impact in this debate is the way we perceive past leaders and the lens through which we process information about them, because we do that primarily through personal identity. This is important because political institutions become defined by personal legacy only because we fetishize personal identity and private lives and feel an emotional connection. Like Hamza said in the POI, because Mandela spent 27 years in prison, that means the ANC is always in power because they play on his legacy. Because the US is the party, the Republicans are the like party of Reagan, they can hark back to the better time and then voters vote for them on that basis. This is only possible because of individuals and their specific identity creating emotional connections which can't be critiqued like policy legacies can. Because I think, to be fair, Keris gave a really good response from opening opposition, and it's very fair when she said people only glorify them because of what they did, not because of their private lives themselves. But the thing is that policy legacy is much easier to critique, right? Because you don't have as much of an emotive tied to it, because policy is much more like rational calculus, said boring, like whatever word you want to use. It's much more about weighing the pros and cons and opportunity cost of how it happened. There's always going to be marginal differences. The difference is the emotional connection to personal identities isn't as rational and can't be calculated through that framework, because it's much more about how you feel about someone. Literally, because of all of OO's mechanisms about lived experience, right? That's the reason why personal identity is a much stronger motivating factor and crowds out like policy legacies, such that this is the biggest reason why we do this. I think this is massively important. This is going to win this debate because we're going to talk about how this stilts democracy, particularly in the developing world, and freezes it. But firstly, because I know this is quite detached from what's happened so far, so I do want to engage in opening clash and try and break the deadlock a bit, because it was a very good debate that happened. So OO say this is better because we can platform minorities and get discourse. OG say it doesn't work because they won't get voted in. We take op at their best, OO at their best, and say even if they do get voted in and then we have discourse about them being a minority, that's really bad for three main reasons. One, because if you make their political power directly associated with their minority status, which is OO stance, the metric by which they're evaluated will always be associated with the characteristics of that minority, which is like, if you're like, yeah, you're a woman, this is fantastic. The characteristics we associate with femininity, such as compassion, are always the metrics by which you're judged. So it makes it harder to do the same things which a male politician could do, because the frame of reference is always directly contingent on your femininity, which puts limitations on what you can do based on social biases which are constructed. So I think that's a harm of emphasizing it. But secondly, and this clashes directly directly with OO's retributive justice point. You put a massive burden on politicians, minority politicians, to represent the whole of the community, literally because of OO's arguments about how they represent lived experience and this is so beneficial. Like, you're literally saying it's your responsibility to represent everyone. That is massively unfair because it puts massive psychological pressure on these politicians, which, like, you know, white, straight men politicians don't have. They can just do whatever they want and be in their self-interest. And I think so it's harmful on them, but it also creates massive psychological pressure, which means it's hard to do your job as effectively if you feel the crushing responsibility to save your whole group on you, because all of the discourse is about, isn't it wonderful that like a black woman has got into power, and you're like, oh my god, now I represent all black women everywhere. That's incredibly difficult and it makes you hard to be effective. But thirdly, and most importantly, I think it massively perpetuates political polarization, because when you have the discourse of being defined by your minority group, that creates the perception that groups are against each other because people perceive identity politics as zero-sum. It's obviously not what we like to think, it's not zero-sum, but that's how they perceive it. The problem is, when identity politics becomes zero-sum, it's always the rich, white, privileged people that win because they have the resources to drown out everyone else. So if you get more polarization because you drive people apart, it makes it harder for minorities to have an influence and power. That's why I think a better comparative is focusing on cooperation and like coalition building between different factions, which is the best way realistically for minorities to have an influence, but more polarization locks out of it. This is independent of OG's mechanisms for people voting on policy, but also engages with OO's best case. So I think that's important in breaking top half. But let's go back to what I said about past legacies of personality politics. The impact of people voting based on past personality legacies are, firstly, that we wash the clash from OO about private lives being linked to your policy, because that is only true in the present space. That is not true in the past space where the policy is done anyway, so it's irrelevant. But second of all, it applies to significantly more people than OG. Trivially, temporally, because there are more politicians in the past than there are now, but more substantively, geographically, because the place this most applies is in the developing world, where systems are much more vulnerable to one-party democracy. Political democracy is less established, so it doesn't operate on all the assumptions which opening half had, which means it's much more vulnerable to legacy politics, being like you feel an emotional connection to one person because we glorify their personal identity, which is the word in the motion, and therefore feel that connection to them. What are the harms of this? First of all, the emotional buy-in to personality and identity insulates these figures from rational critique and rational politics, which means often you get massive lobbying and mobilization behind figures just on the basis of their like figurehood rather than the actual things they did, which Keris did say was the comparative, but I think they had to give reasons why that was the comparative, given that emotional connection insulates you from these things. That's important because when you concentrate inspiration on one specific individual, they then have all of the power of everything you associate with that individual, which is why you get stagnated in the past. That's why it works. But then why is this actually harmful? I think legacy politics means that classic parties right now rely on the emotional feel and attachment to the past, which crowds out new and better solutions. So for example, the ANC always win on the legacy of Mandela and apartheid because you get massive connections to that, as opposed to the comparative. If we were more to focus on policy and we didn't have to think about politics in this very emotional, glorified way, we'd be able to see the ways in which the ANC is screwing around, and other ones could actually co-opt the spirit of what Mandela wanted to do better if we focused on his policy rather than just him as a person. I think secondly, this means that we get less evolution in our views on personal identity, right? Because I think that people in the past are always constrained by the social biases and like racism, sexism, whatever, which existed in the past, and therefore glorifying them at a stagnant point in time also by extension glorifies the views they have, which don't move on with our progressive modes of thinking, which makes it hard. I think racism persists because people want to hark back to the good old days, not because it's based on rational analysis right now. Yes, opening for fairness.
Yeah, can you please explain to me why people don't have an emotive connection to the policy legacy of the ANC?
Yeah, but okay, I mean, to a lesser extent, right? Because I think that's symmetrical on either side. So it's a policy legacy of ending apartheid and the actions Mandela did, detached from him as an individual, because it's Mandela as an individual, which people associate with the ANC. They feel attached to ending apartheid, sure, but all parties in South Africa are like, yay, we ended apartheid. So I don't think that's unique. I think it's a specific policy legacy and the capacity for politicians to jump on this and then co-opt this emotional narrative, which you can't rationally critique because then you're seen as like a traitor of your country, which makes this narrative so powerful. Ultimately, I think this means that established political parties are able to significantly dominate because they play on the legacy of the past. They're playing on narratives of things like independence or ending apartheid, which then crowd out narratives of what's the best going forward. This debate is most important in countries which don't have the political democracy established to be able to get all the amazing benefits of like accountability and good policies, which both opening teams wanted to talk about. You make it harder to do that because we've consistently glorified people over the systems and the actions in which they take, which makes it harder to crowd that out. I think, yeah, this will be the main impact of this is that we stagnate social views at the point when Muslims existed. We credit the development of new systems because people are attached to legacies of the past, so keep voting in ways which are informed by that emotional attachment rather than a rational consideration of what's happening right now. No one else engaged in this debate but what's happening in the past. I think it's a significant impact and therefore it should win. Very proud to propose.
Great. Thank you very much for this speech. I would like to now invite the member of the opposition to continue the debate. Here.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Cool. 3, 2, 1. We're going to do a couple of things in this speech. 1, we're going to engage with top half. 2, we're going to engage with closing government. 3, we're going to talk to you about accountability and why it is that we combat things like political corruption, something that just hasn't been talked about in this debate so far. So let's jump right into it and engage with opening government. Opening government's first claim is that you get better politician performance because people, firstly, can't deflect scrutiny by referencing their private lives, like previous things that they have done, and secondly, that the media are more likely to focus on the policy, meaning a greater degree of scrutiny. 3 responses to this. The first is to say, I don't think this is as huge a problem as they necessarily say it is in influencing people's voting records. That is to say that only large scandals tend to dominate the media and literally change people's minds based on who they are going to vote for, because in general, people are still seeing some degree of scrutiny of these policies on our side of the house. That is to say, I think there is a greater degree of scrutiny that exists when you see that there is a disparity between the private life of a politician and their voting records. I think when you only see that voting record, you cannot hold those politicians to account to the same degree. So we get more scrutiny of these politicians on our side and their motivations on our side of the house. So I think to that extent, then you're still likely to get all of this scrutiny of policy on our side of the house, given that it is still what the media tend to focus on to a certain degree. I think it's not that you get no scrutiny of these things at all, but rather you get scrutiny of both of those things. That's probably better. The second thing to say, though, is I think this is a problem that gets worse on their side when you focus on the personal identity and private lives of these politicians is removed. That is, when only once in a blue moon do you hear something about the private scandals that affect politicians, as opposed to it being a normal part of political discourse, something that you regularly see. It's much more likely to be a bigger deal when it happens. So that means when Bill Clinton does something like cheating on his wife, then when you only see that as something that is like a very extreme, a scandal, and you only see it once every 5-10 years, as opposed to seeing it as something that is regularly discussed in the media, then it's much more likely that these insignificant things become a much larger part of how you evaluate those politicians. I think then it becomes all of the problems that opening government described are actually much worse on their side of the house, whereas on our side of the house, we allow people to normalize this as a part of political discourse and be able to cut through these things and not take them as like large factors upon which they are making political decisions upon. The third thing to say, though, is I think that the only time that we're able to hold and scrutinize politicians on opening government's model is a retroactive one. That is to say that if you're only looking at the voting records of these politicians, then the only time that you can see that that politician is a homophobe, for example, is after you have voted them in and that they have voted for those harmful policies. We tell you it's much better to be able to scrutinize those politicians' private lives so that you can see that they're someone who is homophobic or see that they're someone who is racist because they have done homophobic or racist things in their past before you vote them in, as opposed to allowing them to make those damaging policies in the first place. I think then you're much more likely to get better policy on our side of the house. The second thing we want to talk about is about diversity and how people are going to vote out LGBT individuals. The one thing I want to note about this is that I don't think identity politics is necessarily something that hugely comes into this debate. That is to say that I think most minorities going into politics are very visibly members of minority groups, and like it's very hard to say that just because the media or whatever is not going to focus on their personal identity or not going to focus on their like private lives doesn't mean that people who are racist are still going to like not vote in people who are black. So I think then that this means it is quite limited into the groups that it applies to. It's probably applying only to like LGBT people, for example, who are less visible minorities and wouldn't necessarily be subjected to that scrutiny. I think the thing is, if there are cases about role models and why role models matter, you can only have that when you have a focus on personal identity. You can only normalize people from these minority groups being in politics when you have some form of focus on their personal identity. I think it is much easier to get people voted in the long run who come from these groups, to the extent that you see people who are in these groups being part of politics and not being structurally locked out of it. I.e., if you conceive that politics is a field that people from your group can go into, then you're much more likely to attempt to go into that group. To engage with closing government and their stuff about past legacy. Look, I think this is maybe like, I think it's quite marginal. That is that I think people like Nelson Mandela, yeah, maybe because of his personal identity, but I think the things that these politicians have done in the past are much more significant. That is to say, if you see someone as having liberated your country from another country, then the thing that you're focusing on isn't that person, but rather the things that that person have done. Note that that is not their personal identity or their private life, but rather their policy record. I think then it might be like a little bit lesser if you're not as emotionally attached to that person, but I think it's still very likely that you glorify these people for other reasons that aren't focusing on their identity or aren't focusing on their private lives, but rather you glorify them because of their voting record. Like, I think opening opposition are absolutely correct when you say that people like Margaret Thatcher because she was a raging Tory, but they didn't dislike her because she was Margaret Thatcher. They disliked her because of her policies. And so I think it's much more likely that like specific policies influence these things. I'm not sure it's significantly different, and I'm not sure that they're in this debate. So let's talk about accountability. I think on a principle level, it's important that politicians are held to account. That is to say that legislators are placed in specific positions of power where they're able to control and influence the laws by which the citizens of their country have to abide by, and they are placed into those positions by voters who place an implicit trust in them by either A, explicitly voting them into power, or B, implicitly by not rising up against that government and accepting the legitimacy of that. I think the problem is here that the scrutiny has to be applied to these politicians to make sure that they are abiding by the laws that they set, because to the extent that that is not true, those politicians are hypocritical and clearly are not representative of the people, because they are applying different rules to the people than they do apply to themselves. And to the extent that politicians are not representative, that you cannot have a form of democracy that is legitimate. So if you're an MP who passes really stringent laws on drug use, then if you use drugs, then you clearly have failed and undermined the entire process of democracy in and of itself. That means that you need media scrutiny on the private lives of those politicians to be able to hold those people to account, to principally uphold democracy. Media is literally known as the fourth arm of the state because it's about holding politicians to account on the promises that they make. But note, you have to hold them to account on more than just the promises that they make. You have to make sure that they follow the laws that they pass as well. I think that cannot happen when you don't have this type of scrutiny. But secondly, and more importantly, I think this debate is actually about political corruption. That is to say that when politicians are selfishly motivated, they use their positions of political power to achieve their own selfish agendas. So, for example, Congress members who held lots of stocks and shares decided to sell all of those before they passed coronavirus legislation on lockdown because they knew that the economy was going to collapse. That is political corruption, because these people are abusing their positions of political power to further their own private lives and their own selfish agendas. Note then that corruption in politics is driven by people wanting to better their own circumstances, and you can only understand what somebody's motivations are or why they would be motivated to do these things when you specifically examine their private lives and their personal identities and know who they are outside of their voting records. Because you're not going to know that a random congressperson has a shit ton of stocks and shares because it's not reflected in their voting records. You only know that if you identify their personal identity and their private lives. Note then that motivation is more important than just characters opening opposition state, but is literally important to prevent political corruption existing and to prevent people from being able to abuse the systems of power that we've put them into in the first place. That means if you want to protect a political system that is legitimate and you want to protect a political system from corruption and abuse by these individuals, you have to deter these individuals from doing this by showing that they're able to be called out when they are doing these things and hold them to account by voting them out of office and realizing when they do. That only happens when you scrutinize their personal identity, scrutinize their private lives, and scrutinize more than just their voting records. And it's why we're incredibly proud to oppose.
Great, thank you very much for this speech. Now I'd like to invite the government whip here.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, you can start whenever ready.
I know in debates you have to have structural reasons to prove everything. But Dani, think about Alexander Lylov and his impact on the Socialist Party in your country. Lucía, think about Plutarco Calles and his impact on the PRI. Vaishnav, think of Nehru and his personal influence on the Indian National Congress. And then think of the flip. Who came up with every single policy which is currently on the Democratic Policy Platform? The Civil Rights Act of 1966, Medicaid, Medicare. Jimmy Carter. And yet no one fucking talks about Jimmy Carter for some reason. I think the reason is that Reagan happened to be in Hollywood and JFK was very, very good looking. The problem, panel, is not whether objectively policies had an outcome or not, but it's about how history is written. And history and historiography, and in fact, in hagiography, is always written of those people who are personally interesting. And that's the extension that we had today. Member of opposition's response, unfortunately, was the same response as DLO, which means that if there's any other substantive response, we can't respond to it, which was basically to wash the claim, to say policies matter just as much. One, I've given you a dozen examples in the space of a minute, but let's just say structurally speaking why that's not true. A, policies are really complicated to understand. Two, policies don't work into their outcomes until a decade from now, such as investment in education or infrastructure. Three, people forget about policies. Four, entire policy platforms change. The one thing that doesn't change and is forever crystallized is the personality and the cult personality of that politician, which is why I think it's so important within this debate. Before I weigh that against the rest of the teams, a brief comment on closing opposition. The intrinsic mechanism in closing opposition is that the personal life of a politician is intrinsic to truly viewing their politically corrupt tendencies. First, this is a slightly Hobbesian view to look at it, insofar as I can think of many people who are goody two-shoes in their personal life and are really corrupt people in their political life. I just don't know why human nature manifests itself in the same way in two different areas. But the second thing I say is, my aunt is a gynecologist in Pakistan. She legitimately believes that Adam and Eve were the first human beings on Earth. She does not believe in evolution. She's still a pretty good fucking doctor. I just think if people can have cognitive dissonance about two fundamentally different areas of their life, and literally on practicing science versus believing in it, it's extremely unclear to me why that cognitive dissonance doesn't apply in the case of politics. Because the decisions that you make in politics tend to be macro level, anonymized policy decisions, such as generally should we have private schools or generally should we have public schools, as opposed to individualized decisions that a single individual made. I think that's generally comparing apples and oranges. But the final thing I say about closing opposition, which opening opposition is equally vulnerable to before I go to them, is the idea of how these personalities are interrogated within the media. I'm going to posit that they have led to the rise of the tabloid culture, where the Metro and shitty newspapers like those and Page 3 and all of that stuff make it about the most sensationalist aspects of their personality, as opposed to anything digestible by a normal, rational public. The implications of this on closing opposition is that even if everything that they're saying is true, and I've given you reasons for why it's not, the way that the personality comes out in the media is so horrible that it focuses on the most sensationalist and least useful parts of the personality. Also, on opening opposition then, that if voters do vote rationally, I think the biggest problem there, apart from the empirical reality of Brexit and Trump, is that the media will show you the most sensationalist aspects of that politician as opposed to anything meaningful about their persona. Opening opposition had two additional claims. The first interesting claim was that lived experiences are crucial to voting properly. I have a few responses here. The first response is to do with making it a black versus white issue. And I think this is a huge problem. Right now, if America bans chokeholds and night raids, this genuinely helps everyone. Just like Breonna Taylor, a black person died, Eric Tampa, a white person died. The reason that we will never pass those policies is because of identity politics, because it's black politicians who are treated as black on black caucuses with black policy platforms vying for those issues. So if anything, there's a huge alignment of incentives between different communities, but you never get those policies passed. And the second thing I say is I question the intuition that only black people can represent black people. For the reasons that opening opposition gave, I think there's a bit more nuance to life than that. If I see a rich Pakistani fucker who is prime minister, currently the rich Pakistani fucker who is prime minister, I don't see him as Pakistani because his lived experiences are very different from mine. Similarly, for a kid living in the ghetto or projects, I don't think they look at Obama and say, that's who I want to be. You will never be that person because you've never had the trajectory of that person. You've never been to fucking Harvard. But the last thing I say here, which I think is equally important to understand, is that you make strategic decisions about policy all the time. Sometimes you strategically elect a white mayor, read New York right now, to get policy concessions through, knowing full well that you're electing that person for the racist tendencies of the other side, just to push policy platforms through. Because I genuinely think opening opposition's case is slightly idealist insofar as it focuses on only black people getting in and getting the vote in and passing lots of policies. For those reasons then, closing opposition's argument about electoral accountability and political corruption doesn't stand, and opening opposition's argument about mobilization and lived experiences doesn't stand. How does Kira's extension interact with everyone else? The first thing I really want to point out here is that every single claim and opening can only be true if it's only about politics in the present. I just want to put this out there. Secondly, if you buy anything of opening government and buy nothing of ours, if anything, we double the amount of impacts in this debate because we're talking about both the present and the past in a very trivial sense. But we give you additional mechanisms for why that tends to be true. We showed you that the legacy is entrenched through the writing of history. We showed you that it's to do with the memorialization of the past. For instance, Trump doesn't say, I'm racist, hence I will be against black people. Trump says, let's go back to the past. And now I'm going to ask Jason if he disagrees with whether what's that Trump says. Go on.
Yeah, it's a politician's job to represent us, and it's legitimate for minorities to want their views represented. This burden is legitimate, and it's unclear why it's bad. Given this, please explain the actual mechanism for your
Jason,
rational
I have 50
critique.
seconds left. No, I agree it's legitimate. It's a regrets debate. We're not banning someone from doing anything. It's legitimate. I just think it's all consequentially stupid. So the final thing that I was just saying, which I think is really, really important, is that even was that we're talking about a huge net of cases in this debate. So realistically, we're talking about the entrenchment of post-colonial politics or post-conflict politics in each of these societies. Remember, panel, the policies that these people implement tend to go away, but it's the persona that we remember. The Mandela, Nobel Prize winning Mandela, the Nehru, whose force of personality agitated people's move for Indian independence, etc., etc. That's the sort of thing that people often look for, and that's why I think it always leads to a huge entrenchment in 4 different ways. One, you always harken back to failed policies of the past. This is what's happening right now. Trump goes back to Reagan-era policies, even though they've tried and failed. 2, it leads to a huge polarization, because if you look at a white guy in the past, you want a white guy in the future. And 3, it leads to no new policy ideas and platforms coming out, because any new party which comes in cannot rely on the legacy of the past, just like traditional parties can. Panel, to sum it up, this debate is about the entrenchment of the personas of the past to hugely negatively impact the politics of the present. We're very, very proud to propose.
Great, thank you very much. And finally, I would like to call up on the opposition whip to conclude this debate. Here, here.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're audible.
Okay. Three things in this speech. Firstly, is it separated what you do in private life and what you do once you're voted in, or what you do as a politician? Secondly, about accountability, and thirdly, responding to CG about less developed countries and democracy currently. Firstly, about this, what both government teams kind of want to say is that there's nothing necessarily that connects you, what you act in a person, who you are as a person, and what it is that you're going to do as a politician. I think then that, if you want to have this kind of a big impact, is probably the same to what your voting rights, like voting the way you voted before was, and what you're going to do in the future. I, however, think that it is very likely that those two things are connected. Yes, maybe they can have an example or two about how this was like different in what people did, but the vast majority of cases, what you see where the person is coming from, this is how you can know what their incentives are, what they want to do, and what they're likely to be fighting for before they're even voted in. So exactly at the point of which, when OG says there's no accountability once the person is voted in, this is exactly true. We tell you that this is why you need to know before they're voted in what they're likely to be doing, what their predispositions are, how likely they are to lie, and stuff like that. You can only know that if you know what this person is like and how far they're willing to go when they're making any types of decisions. I think more likely those stuff happen when you just simply have more knowledge about this kind of stuff. At a point at which, when it's connected to the way you live your life, the experiences that you have, the types of problems that you had once you were growing up, and so on, I think it's informative in you knowing what types of stuff is going to happen, the kind of stuff that people are going to know in the future. So we win this even if there's less coverage of stuff, of the policies that they're doing in the future, because at a point at which, when you know how they're going to act, you can predict to a very large extent what type of policies they're going to be fighting for. I think at that point, you don't need to have like very smart ZPMs who will read all the news, because you can rely more on the politicians, and you don't simply have to hold them, like, given that there are no ways to do it, to hold them comfortable, and so on. I think secondly, when it comes to like people like getting into power, we tell you that it is likely that it's people who simply have perverse incentives. This is why Biden just like shifted what he cares about. Suddenly it was about African Americans, because this is what he needed in order to win. We tell you less likely those type of stuff happens when you see that this is a corrupt way for them to getting in power. I think more likely that you get people who generally want to pass this kind of legislation, are generally like good in that kind of a sense to be bringing those type of issues at the end. I think secondly, when they talk about this kind of a narrative of how it's good if there are more people of certain minorities, like both openings talk about this, how this is a goal that more minorities are in power. Look, all of this is like a predisposition for all of this is that people vote for it in the first place and they're known. I think more likely that they're known in a case that you know their backgrounds and that you want to read the news because they're so interesting. But also at a point at which, when OG says, yeah, but they're going to kind of sneakily come in because nobody's actually going to know that they're LGBT and so on. I think at that point, many people don't vote for them because they don't know why they would be voting for somebody who they like are not sure if it would even be running for the kind of issues that they care about. But also they don't have the ability to make many changes, because exactly at the point when you're LGBT, more likely that people assume that you're LGBT, more people are going to be careful as to what you're doing, but you're actually going to be shut down. So I think more likely when you already have a campaign that is saying these are the stuff that I'm fighting for, and I'm proud of the stuff that otherwise could be like mechanized into being something bad, I think more likely to have this kind of rights and more likely to have policies that are discuss about it. But also note, we talked to you about the scandals, and this was never responded to by CG, which tells you at a point at which people have a huge baggage about their from personal lives, for example, being closeted or whatever, and once they're voted in, there's much more likelihood that you get to know that there's a scandal about whatever was happening to them, right? We tell you that exactly at the point at which when you don't focus on this kind of stuff all the time, it becomes much more important when you have certain instances of this type of stuff happening. This is why we talk so much about Clinton's like scandal about like being with Monica Lewinsky, right? At the point at which when you don't focus on it all the time, and you can simply dismiss the stuff that was a mistake for the people or for stuff that they don't think is as important, right? This is why we can move on from those kind of stuff. For example, for Elizabeth Warren, at the point at which when you see, look, all of the politicians are human beings, and we shouldn't imagine as if they're perfect or that they're inhumane or stuff like that. I think more likely than in those cases that you have actually the ability to see how the connections are formed and to in what ways people are likely to act. Secondly, about accountability, before the OG.
So Trump was able to deflect criticism from not putting his business in a blind trust because of endless news stories about how rich he is. Corruption is much more likely to be called out on our side when you get to have like criminal investigations.
I'm talking about accountability in my second point. Firstly, about highlighting policies, and secondly, about trusting too much and so on. Firstly, about highlighting policies. I think at the point at which on government side, you have more limited time as to what you're going to be talking about because it's more boring or because it's simply more detailed and like as CG tells you, right? It's just difficult, like it's difficult to remember all of it. I think you have more limited time as to what you can talk about. At a point at which on our side, what you can have is talk about individual, become interested in stuff, like follow the whole story about somebody is becoming a president. More likely that you're more interested in the news and people actually want to hold them accountable because they see them as somebody who has failed them as a person and who has done something that is a very problematic thing to them. I think also you're more willing to look into details of the stuff because you know that this is something that the person should never be doing, given that like all the background and all the justification they give you, to stand on your side. Secondly, they talk about how we trust these minorities so much and then they can get away with stuff. Look, to a very great extent, I think you need to, like, when you promise this kind of stuff and you justify it by who you are as a person, more likely to be called out on those kind of stuff. But secondly, when we talk about white people, like changing what they're actually running for, and I think they in order for them to be voted in, it's a higher barrier to show how many policies they want to do in order to be stepped in and in order to pass them, in order for them to be voted in, right? Because the comparative is I could just vote for somebody who definitely will be running on those kind of stuff because of where they're coming from, or this white guy who I'm not sure about, but they have so many policies, so more likely to have more accountability. Lastly, on less developed countries and stuff like that, I think firstly, you can only move away from the kind of past stuff at a point at which when you can start talking about politicians currently and their present lives and how they're amazing people. I think you're always going to be looking back at amazing policies and the people who established the democracy and so on in our lives at a point at which when you cannot actually humanize the people who currently live. But I also think at a point at which when you actually, if we would actually be talking about identities of Reagan and so on, we would see how bad of a people they were, as opposed to mainly highlighting the policies or whatever. We would see how they were just a human being who, I don't know, was being Joseph, or who was weird, or like who had some kind of like who humanized it, right? This is why you cannot just rely on the past narratives of a person being glorified and so on, but rather you move away from it at a point at which when you can actually see their lives. I think maybe not enough of it is happening currently if they want to talk about this kind of narratives of like older people keep being in the discourse currently. This is why probably more of the transparency also on our side, those reasons as you.
Great, thank you everyone for this debate.